Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Thank you very much. That was an extremely kind and warm welcome and well said, so I appreciate it greatly. It's really a delight for me to see all of you here, and I do want to emphasize what Glenn said. You know, the Q&A time is really a chance for us to be real and genuine and honest with one another, whether we agree or disagree. And there's a lot that can happen in that when we genuinely challenge one another. And so I encourage you to ask questions, and I will do my very best to respond to them. Before I start into the meat of the talk today, I do want to say some thank yous. I really appreciate the work that the campus ministers have done to set this event up. I also want to thank Veritas for the work that they do and for the opportunity that they've given me to speak to you all today. So, are we more than our genes? That's the topic for today's talk. And at the heart of this question is a search for identity. And I think that that is a pursuit that resonates with most, if not all of us. So, who am I? Well, I'm a Christian and a scientist with a Hindu background, Indian ancestry, Canadian birth, and American citizenship. So that's quite a lot to unpack. So given today's talk, I'm going to start with a little bit about who I am as a scientist. So I trained in computer science, as you've just heard, as an undergraduate at Cornell University. And toward the latter part of my years at Cornell, I did research in a computational neurobiology lab, where I did mathematical modeling of olfaction, or the sense of smell. You and I can actually discriminate among thousands of different types of smells. And we accomplished this with the use of a very intricate information processing network in our olfactory system. This field was very rewarding for me because it allowed me to see the value of interdisciplinary study, applying my mathematical and computational skills and training to understand biological phenomena. But I also felt somewhat limited by the difficulty in generating the appropriate kind of data so that I could test sophisticated mathematical models. It was around this time that the field of genomics was exploding onto the scene because of the Human Genome Project. This was an international endeavor to determine the entire sequence of human DNA. And the project was completed well in advance of the projected due date, largely due to remarkable advances in technology and biocomputing. It was clear that the Human Genome Project was ushering in a very new era in science where the bottleneck was no longer data generation or the availability of data, but how were we going to make sense of the volumes of data that we were now capable of generating and storing? So motivated by this challenge, I enrolled in a PhD program in genomics and computational biology at the University of Pennsylvania. And after my PhD work in that field, I joined the lab of Dr. Francis Collins at the National Institutes of Health as a postdoctoral fellow to study genomics in the context of human disease. Specifically, what are the signals in the genome that tell us that we might be at risk for Alzheimer's or diabetes? And if we can find those signals, what are the clues that might indicate why they are increasing our risk for those diseases? Those are the kinds of questions that I was interested in and remain interested in to this day. Following my stint at the NIH, I joined the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where I am today as a professor in the Department of Genetics. And I continue to investigate genomics and human disease. My responsibilities as a faculty member are very diverse, but one of the most exciting things I get to do is to cast a scientific vision and then lead a research team to execute on that vision. Recently, large international teams have collaborated to identify thousands of specific DNA mutations or variants that are associated with complex diseases like prostate cancer and Alzheimer's and diabetes and heart disease. And one of the most significant discoveries from these studies is that the vast majority of complex disease-associated DNA mutations occur in regions of the genome that do not code for genes. Instead, these regions contain important functional elements that regulate where and when and to what extent genes are going to be turned on. In other words, they're kind of like switches or dials. You may have heard on the news at some point or the other that someone with a disease had the bad gene or the defective gene. But what we now appreciate more than ever before is that most of complex disease-associated variants are not in the genes themselves. They're in these switch regions that are controlling gene activation. My lab at UNC, broadly speaking, is interested in finding out where all of these switches are and figuring out which ones are more relevant in what diseases. To accomplish this, we've taken advantage of recent progress in a field called epigenomics. So the prefix epi there is a Greek word, and it means above or beyond. So epigenomics refers to a set of mechanisms that are beyond the DNA, but are still able to control gene activation. So let's consider our DNA for a minute, okay, just to get some context. It's present in almost every individual cell in our body. And in each of those cells, if you took out the DNA, which is about 3 billion nucleotide pairs, and you stretched it out end to end, it would amount to about 6 feet. Just DNA in one cell. If you then took the DNA from all of the cells in one body and stretched it out end to end, it would be hundreds of millions of miles. That is a lot of material and information packed into one body. So you can imagine how tightly wound up and packaged the DNA is in each of our cells. Each cell is actually able to make marks on the packaging material. And this indicates where certain important parts of the DNA are. So for example, if in a particular region you see the marks A, B, and C, it might tell you that you might have a regulatory switch there in the underlying DNA sequence. The fascinating thing about this is that environmental variables like diet or smoking or other lifestyle choices can change these marks and thereby completely alter genome function without actually touching or altering the DNA sequence. So what this says, right, is that your genetics doesn't completely determine who you are. The environment around you shapes the packaging material of your DNA and directs, to some extent, how your DNA is going to work. So that already tells us that we are indeed more than our genes. So maybe the question we really need to ask is, are we more than our biology, right? Are we more than the material things, genes or otherwise, that make up our bodies? As a biologist, I've learned at least 3 major lessons that I'd like to share with you today that I think help provide a framework for exploring that important question. First, biological science is very rarely about proof. Rather, it's more about accumulating evidence toward a reasonable or likely or compelling explanation. You know, in theoretical mathematics, one deals with derivations and hard rules and proofs. In contrast, in the biological sciences, one is usually collecting diverse kinds of data and making inferences. Now don't get me wrong, there's certainly a logic that guides your inferences, but it's often more imprecise than people realize. Science is, it's actually a lot like detective work. And in fact, that's what I find so fun about the research that me and my lab do. I mean, think of what a detective does. Right? He or she is faced with a crime and essentially has to reconstruct the course of events that led to the crime. Obviously, often there are many possibilities, and so the job of the detective is to gather information and make a case for the most likely possibility. Oftentimes, the case is so strong that it feels like a proof to me and you. But it's not really. It's just a far more compelling scenario than any other possible explanation. It's sometimes the same way in biology. As a scientist, I'm faced with a particular unexplained biological phenomenon and essentially have to uncover the hidden mechanisms by which it occurs. So this is a lot more like messy detective work than it is like proving theorems in theoretical mathematics. And so that brings me to the second lesson that I've learned, and that is that biological science is constantly self-correcting, and it almost never closes the door on a possibility, even if it happens to defy present assumptions. A prominent example in my field is the concept of junk DNA. Many of you may have even heard about this. Prior to the genome era, the prevailing wisdom among many scientists was that substantive portions of the genome were likely non-functional. That's why they were sort of given the name junk or nonsense. Later on, many of the same scientists eventually produced the evidence that demonstrated that this was wrong. My point here is no matter how tightly held the view of junk DNA was at one point, there was still an openness in the scientific community to the possibility that it wasn't junk. And it was ultimately this openness that led to new evidence, the dismantling of the misconceptions, and scientific advancement. It's for this reason that you will very rarely see universal negatives issued in biology. I mean, even the vocal atheist Richard Dawkins accepted that as a scientist, he must concede that there could be something incredibly grand and incomprehensible and beyond our present understanding. Now, I don't want to misrepresent Richard's position here. He certainly doesn't believe in a higher power. But my point here is that as a scientist, he is compelled to concede the possibility, however unlikely he may ultimately believe that to be. Finally, the third lesson is that some questions that have arisen from work in genetics cannot be addressed by tools in genetics or biology. For example, at some point during the study of genetics, the question often arises, why did life forms originate in the first place? And it's a natural question to ask, and we're free to speculate, but science is not really equipped to answer that question. And using science to answer questions like these sometimes feels like using colors to describe numbers. I mean, I think you'll agree that color, though by itself is meaningful, is not at all a meaningful construct to understand numbers. So while work in science might naturally lead us to ask such questions, it's evident that science does not always have a clear answer, or even the toolkit to approach the answer. I want to make a critical point here. This doesn't mean that there is an answer somewhere else. It just means that we have to be faithful to what science is, and we can't extend the purview of science beyond what it is capable of addressing. So how do these lessons inform the pursuit of the answer to the question, are we more than our biology? I believe that they liberate us from shackles and the commonly held and often propagated view that science categorically disproves the supernatural, or even that science is the sole arbiter of truth. In fact, science is necessarily agnostic with respect to anything outside of the natural realm. It neither accepts it, nor can it refute it. So the important point here is that science does not constrain us to look only to science in our search for identity. Again, doesn't imply that there's anything anywhere else, but it doesn't constrain us to look only to science in our pursuit. So what else might define who I am? Well, maybe my name is a good starting point. So my name, Praveen Sethupathy, is of Sanskrit origin, and Praveen means skillful. Sethupathy means Lord of the Bridge, and the bridge refers to a former chain of limestone shoals that connected the southern tip of India to the northern coast of Sri Lanka. And according to the ancient Hindu epic, the Ramayana, the bridge was constructed by Lord Rama and his army. So, needless to say, my name is steeped in ancient Indian tradition and Hindu lore. And my Indian heritage is a part of who I am. I'm proud of it. I was raised as a Hindu for 18 years, and I appreciated Hinduism as a rich culture to enjoy. But it wasn't until my college years that I realized I didn't really know much about Hinduism as a belief system to live by. I had kind of gone through the motions of various aspects of Hinduism and was familiar with many of the traditions and stories of the faith. But I realized that I had no idea what it, or frankly, religion in general, meant to me, or how it shaped me, if at all. I hadn't really stopped to think about it, right? In college, a friend introduced me to the Christian Bible, and as I sat there reading it, I became intrigued by how it compared with other religions. And so over the course of several years, I attempted to read the scriptures from many different faith traditions, including Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam. What was it that stood out for me in Christianity. It was meeting the character of Jesus. He's the supposed hero of this story, right? And there he is, naked, disfigured, and almost too pathetic for me to even read on in the story. It was not the superhero Krishna that I so enjoyed and was used to reading about, or even the sort of valiant warrior Muhammad that I eventually spent some time studying. One of the first things I would learn is that in the cross, that thing that seemed so pathetic to me, Jesus was turning upside down our notions of power. He wasn't on the cross, it seems, because he was powerless to stop it. He was on the cross because that's how far he'd go to exercise his power to make things new. I mean, you and I often exercise power by forcing our authority or perceived superiority on others in the world. Jesus seemed to be exercising his power by laying his life down before the world. It seemed backwards. In other words, he was choosing to use his power solely for the benefit of others and not himself. I, frankly, had never really read anything like this, particularly in a religious context, which to me was more about, at the time, morality and law. Now, none of this made me a Christian, but it did really intrigue me, and it made me want to deepen my knowledge of this person, who seemed in many ways so contrary to what I would have imagined a hero of a story to be. So at some point, I became involved in evaluating the various claims of the gospel accounts. And really the first question was, what is the evidence that Jesus even existed? In scientific research, we are trained to go to great lengths to design experiments in a way that reduces bias as much as possible. You'll all be very familiar with this. That is, we aim to avoid or account for any tendencies in the experimental setup that might encourage one result over another. I think I must have had this impulse even in my early years because it was critical to me at that time to examine the evidence for the historicity of Christ outside of the Bible, which of course I viewed as a biased source. I was surprised at the time to find that several non-Christian ancient historians had recorded events about Jesus. One example is the writings of Josephus, a first-century Jewish scholar and historian. He's considered by many to be a premier source of first-century Jewish history. His works include multiple references not only to Jesus, but also to several of the other characters that are central to the biblical account of Jesus' life. So this includes, John the Baptist or Herod the Great or Pontius Pilate. Now, to be clear, even this is not bias-free. For example, there is some evidence to suggest that the texts of Josephus may have been contaminated over time with what's called Christian interpolation, meaning there could have been some tampering, right, with the text, possibly even the injection of references to Jesus that were not originally there. What one learns upon digging further is that the writings of Josephus, as well as a number of other ancient historians, have been subject over the years to very meticulous language analysis. And the broad consensus among numerous Christian and non-Christian scholars is that when you strip away anything that may be perceived to be inauthentic, what you're left with still includes direct references to Jesus and his contemporaries. The first-century Roman historian Tacitus also specifically mentions Jesus, as well as his crucifixion and the Roman persecution of the early Christians. What's interesting about that text is that Tacitus writes in a way that is clearly derogatory toward Christians and the Christian faith. And so it takes quite a bit of mental gymnastics to imagine that this text could be the product solely of Christian tampering. And it isn't just Josephus and Tacitus. There are other examples, of course. But let's be fair. Analyses of ancient texts, it's fraught with all sorts of challenges. And none of this, extra biblical documentation was necessarily slam dunk evidence to me. But the point is that it was certainly much more than I would have expected to find if Jesus was merely a legend or a fabrication of creative minds. Now, it's one thing to examine whether Jesus was a real historical figure. Many non-Christians even accept this. But it's quite another to examine whether he really was resurrected. And this matters a whole lot. because the resurrection is central to the Christian faith. In fact, Christianity actually rises or falls on the validity of the resurrection. None of it matters if the resurrection did not happen. So to examine the claims of the resurrection, I focused at the time largely on the biblical narrative itself. And in retrospect, this is not unlike what I do as a scientist sometimes when I evaluate the validity of the claims in a novel scientific paper. That is, I look for clues in the description of the experiments and the data that help me evaluate the reliability of the overall conclusions and interpretation. I mean, in doing this with the biblical account of the resurrection, I was struck by several features of the story, and I'd like to share just a couple of them with you to give you a sense of what I mean. First, consider Jesus' disciples. As the story unfolds, the disciples are rather confused by everything that's happening, and frankly, they come across as not only a bit dense, but immature. They just don't seem to grasp the profundity of what's happening, and they're still sort of scared by it all. Contrast this, okay, with the women in the story, who are bold, faithful, and much more in tune with who Jesus is. In fact, it's the women that first find the empty tomb. It's a woman that the resurrected Jesus first appears to. And it's the women who have the privilege of sharing with the community the good news that Jesus has been raised from the dead. I mean, this might seem like a small detail, but I want to assure you, this is a really big deal for that time period. I mean, at the time, to put it very mildly, women were not well respected. And their word was so undervalued that, for example, their witness was not even admissible in court. And I had to ask myself the question, if you're making up a story that you want others to follow, why in the world would you cast yourself and your buddies in such a poor light and have yourself be outwitted and outblessed at every turn by women who, as I said at the time, were thought of in a rather pejorative manner? Just didn't compute. Second, consider the well-documented exponential growth of the early Christian movement despite tremendous persecution, even unto death. The biblical account makes it clear that the entire faith rests on the validity of the empty tomb of Christ. Now, let's suppose the tomb was not really empty. If you want to devise a clever story to maximize followers, okay, why lay as the foundation of your movement something that is so easy to disprove? I mean, walk over to the tomb and check it out, right? In fact, it seems that historically, even most detractors of Christianity have accepted the empty tomb. And this is why many alternate theories actually have been proposed as to how the tomb became empty. In the interest of getting back to the main point of today's talk, I won't get into all of these now, but suffice to say, the task for me at the time was to determine the model or the explanation that best fit these kinds of data and features in the story. And this is by nature a very inexact process, but it is often what we do in science as well. I mean, consider the theory of common descent, which proposes an evolutionary model for biological life, that all living organisms share a common ancestor. I mean, I, together with the vast majority of biologists, are strong proponents of common descent. And the reason for this is not because we can provide proof in the purest sense of the word, as I suppose that would entail going back in history and reliving it. Rather, it's because of the accumulation of diverse types of supporting evidence that strongly challenge the plausibility of really any other explanatory model. In fact, it's the genomic data generated in the last decade, which I'm involved in studying, that in my opinion most powerfully bolsters the evolutionary model. And I share this because this is to some extent how I approached the claims of historicity of both Christ as well as the resurrection. So why was all this examination so important, and moreover, why am I taking all this time telling you about it? The first reason is that, stripped of Christ, Christianity was no more or less compelling to me than any other faith tradition. I mean, it was the person of Jesus that made all the difference to me. And so it was vital to me that I examine some of these claims. The second reason, and I think this one is more germane to today's topic, is that if Jesus is who he said he was, then I have to ask, what did he have to say about our collective search for identity? Well, he says that we find our true identity in him. And this is perhaps best encapsulated in Paul's statement in Galatians that it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Of course, that doesn't mean that he has taken over our body physically. And so what this is conveying is that we have a spiritual nature, which Christ wants to mold and transform, that is not entirely captured by the material substance of our body. This is a belief. It is not testable or set forth by science. And as such, I entirely understand that it can be unnerving. I've been there. But it is something that is established in my life, ultimately as part of a relationship. I want to emphasize here that my various examinations of the historicity of Christ and other claims of the Bible did not bring me to full faith, as much as they broke down barriers that might have prevented me from considering the possibility of a deeper spiritual reality. In some ways, it's not a perfect analogy, but it's kind of like the love I have for my wife. Ultimately, it's not scientifically provable, per se, but it's certainly real. And she trusts it as real because of the experience and the depth of our relationship over the last 15 years. It's been very much the same for me as I've pursued getting to know the person of Christ. When I started following Jesus and finding my identity in him, it was a very confusing time for my family. Was I rejecting my Indian culture? Would I change my name? Would I suddenly become John or maybe Peter? Their confusion was not unfounded because many before me in a similar position had done exactly that. But Christ did not come to change names or to move people from one culture to another. He came to renew hearts and minds and to bring life where there was death. So it was my joy to share with my family at the time that I would remain Praveen Sethupathy, that Christ was laying a claim on my heart, not on my name. And I explained that becoming Christian had nothing to do with rejecting my Indian heritage or being called by a different name. Rather, it was about redeeming my spiritual identity. Christ was filling me with a renewed sense of purpose and a commitment to others and a passion for justice. The Christian faith has been multicultural from the very beginning, actually. And today, there may be more Christians in China and India and Africa than in Europe and North America. My Hindu heritage will always be a part of who I am. And maybe some of you feel the same way about your cultural background, be it Jewish or Muslim or Buddhist or humanist or anything else. But remember that our cultural background and our core beliefs about God too often get confused as the same thing. While they may be related to some extent, they're truly distinct parts of our identity, I believe. So in your own search for identity, I would challenge you tonight to ask yourself the hard questions. Maybe like me, you haven't done that yet. And maybe you have a background in the Christian faith or in another faith tradition or no faith at all. But if you haven't asked yourself the hard questions about what that means to you and how that's relevant in your own search for identity, now is a great time to reflect on that and to do your own detective work. What I shared with you today was a little bit of my own story. But don't take my word for it. Don't be afraid to be honest with yourself, because there's nothing to lose. And if there really is a God who has endowed you with a spiritual nature, then there's possibly everything to gain in your search for identity. Thank you very much. So I am extremely happy to take any questions. There are standing mics on either side, so please come down and ask your questions.
Okay, so I was at the coffee hour earlier. We kind of already talked about some of this. But my question is, earlier you mentioned science doesn't have the tools to approach the question of why life formed on Earth. I would argue that we do have some tools to kind of start taking stabs at the how, the thermodynamics of self-assembly and everything. Where do you draw the line between why questions and how questions, and at what point does a reductionist explanation of these big questions we're interested in, at what point does that become I don't know, threatening to the faith, if at all?
Yeah, I don't personally believe that it is threatening to the faith, and I think that's because of where science sits with respect to the questions that faith is addressing, right? And so as I said earlier, I think that by definition it's agnostic to it, right? And so the worst that it can do is to say it can't be known by science, right? And in fact, that can be very helpful because it kind of liberates us from trying to, fit a square object into a round hole, right? Now, the earlier question, about that how do you separate the how from the why is just, we could talk about that for the next 2 hours. It's a great question, but I don't know exactly how to define that line, except to say that I think what I really mean to get out by the why is, what is the purpose? What is the function? Is there anything behind it that is more meaningful than what we see by eye, right? And so I think that is pretty different than the how, because how I think still makes me think of mechanism and process that we might be able to put some pieces together and map, even if we don't have the full picture. But the why sort of superimposes onto that. What's the purpose? What's the function? Is there purpose? Is there function? And I think the best we can say with science is, I don't know. We don't have the tools to probe that further, right? And that may be a place where people are comfortable living. But I think what's important about issuing that declaration is that you are free to explore other spaces that maybe have something to say about that question. Thanks for kicking it off, Julie. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor. That was a very interesting talk. The question I'm going to ask is not that much related to spirituality, but more related to non-coding DNA. So in The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins proposed a view of the world that you, me, I, everybody in this room are just machines for propagating our genes. Now, specifically, endogenous retroviruses.
Yeah.
They're non-coding DNAs, but
Yeah.
they're present in everybody's genome.
Yep.
Now, they might be non-coding, but some of them do serve a functional purpose, like the promoters of the enzyme amylase.
Mm-hmm.
So, my question to you is, do you view that those endogenous retroviruses in our genomes have attained the highest level of being able to propagate themselves properly without, expending any energy and just surviving in this world?
So are you asking, are the ERVs, the endogenous retroviruses, sort of the epitome of the selfish gene?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, let me just give some brief background to everybody who's not as familiar with ERVs. So, endogenous retroviruses, okay, let's just pick that phrase apart here. A virus, okay, is capable of infecting a host, so it could be me or you, okay, and of integrating into our genomes. Okay, so we can actually see our genomes littered across it are actually the genomes of some of these ancient viruses. Okay, which is very interesting. And I was actually going to, bring up ERVs in a very different context, with reference to molecular evidence for, common descent and things like that. But what these are, it's viral sequences that are integrated into our genome. What they can do is copy themselves and then paste themselves somewhere else in our genome. So this is they're a part of a class of elements in our genome called retrotransposons. There are many different types, of which ERVs is one that the questioner has raised. What's interesting about these ERVs is that they can keep on copying and pasting themselves and just insert themselves, not quite randomly. There are some preferences to where they like to insert themselves, but quite a lot of places across the genome. And you can imagine if you've inserted a new sequence smack in the middle of a gene, it's really going to be pretty detrimental to the host, right? But it turns out that it seems like the host has been able to take advantage of some of these ERVs, and they have evolved new functions. And so they do certain kinds of things that may actually benefit the host. in some instances. And so it's an ongoing field of study, but that's sort of what ERVs are. Okay. That is a very interesting question about whether ERVs are sort of the epitome of the selfish gene. I think that there is a lot of selfishness encoded in the ERV, right? They are, I mean, their primary purpose is indeed to try to propagate themselves, right? And this is often to the detriment of the host, right? But what's intriguing is that there are, you know, in evolution, you can actually introduce beneficial mutations, right? That then introduce new functions that are actually useful for the host, right? And so it may be an effort by the ERV to be as selfish as it can, but evolution is not restricted to selfishness, apparently, right? There are, you know, it works off of the template of mutations that can often also be helpful for the host. So while the ERV is trying to be selfish, I suppose in some way, you know, the host can be selfish as well. And so I don't think that it's necessarily the epitome because it can be beaten. Does that make sense? Can you, if not, please go ahead and clarify if I've missed.
It makes sense.
Okay.
It makes sense, but I can save questions for later.
Okay, please do. Yes, please, go ahead.
So, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So when the Bible says that we are fearfully and wonderfully made and that we're made in the image of God, it would seem to imply that there's some element of design. And indeed, when you look at the human body, to a lot of people, maybe not as trained in science, but it seems to cry out that it seems to point to some kind of a designer. Do you identify at all with the, I guess, the intelligent design movement?
I don't in the sort of specific prescriptions of the ID movement, but I don't think that holding to a position of evolution denies necessarily God as a designer, okay? Because, you know, oftentimes God being a designer is merged with him having designed it and created it instantaneously. And I don't think they have to go hand in hand. You can be the designer of something and have created something over the course of billions of years and still be the designer. What we're talking about here is just the mode of creation, the mode of how he brought things into existence, right? And so that's why I think it's harmonious to think of God as the author and the designer, but believe that the mode of that creation is not necessarily instantaneous.
Right. I guess my question is, do you believe that the process of natural selection and, I guess, through mutation is completely random?
So, okay, random is a loaded word, and we use it very incorrectly most of the time, me included. So it's not on you. Yeah, I was talking about this earlier. I think it was Julie during the coffee hour. You know, we really harp on this concept of randomness, which I think what we're really bothered by as Christians is the sense that seems to provide that there's no purpose, right? That it's all just kind of, you know, happening in the wind, and, you know, there's no sort of direction or purpose to anything. You know, there are quite a lot of things that we do all the time that we are happy to say are random, but are not inconsistent with God being the author and the sustainer of life right now, right? Whether I scratch my head right now, we're happy to call that a random act, right? But somehow we're also happy to say that it is, in a way that we can't explain, still consistent with God being the sustainer and the, you know, a driver of life as we know it right now in this instant, right? And so I think that, you know, are there, you know, can polymerase, as it's chugging along during replication when mutations occur, technically, can it do it anywhere, right? Yeah, technically, right? So from that point of view, we can think of it as random. But I don't believe that it is random, because much like scratching my head, because that seems like it's kind of random, but much like that, I don't think it's inconsistent with God still being the ultimate driver of the process. See what I mean? I can't necessarily draw those edges and tell you exactly how that works, but if I could tell you everything about how God works, you know, I don't think we'd even be having this event. Please.
Sorry, a bit of a broad question, but you mentioned evidence in the human genome for common descent.
Yeah.
Could you give a few examples?
Yeah, sure. So, well, let's just piggyback off of the ERV discussion. Okay. So remember that these ERVs we think are integration events from ancient viruses, okay, upon infection. All right. If you analyze the human genome, any one of our genomes really, okay, you'll see several hundred thousands of these integration events littered across our genome. Okay, and the numbers in each research paper that's put out vary slightly, let's say 200,000. Okay. Now, many retrotransposons like ERVs, when they copy and insert themselves somewhere else, okay, the cells have mechanisms to mutate those ERVs or truncate them or something of that kind so that the next time they paste themselves in, they can't do that jumping stuff anymore, right? So it's a way to kind of make them inert, okay? And so we see examples of inert ERVs and retrotransposons littered across our genome as well, okay? And if I compared the locations of all of my ERVs with yours, they will be highly, 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 highly similar. Okay, very, very, very high percentage. Okay, but I don't think anybody here is arguing against all humans having a common ancestor. Okay, so let's dig deeper. Sequence the chimp genome. Okay, what you'll see is that integration events have happened. The vast majority of integration events and locations of ERVs in chimps are exactly where they are in humans. This is a very different argument than saying, look, I just took my genome, compared it to the chimp genome, it's 99.9% similar, or 95%, whatever number you want to throw out there, and that's evidence for common descent. I don't actually think that it is necessarily. It's consistent with common descent, but it's also consistent with the idea that a designer instantaneously made two different organisms and used very, very similar principles, right? And so I don't actually buy that argument as much as I do when you analyze dynamic events that have occurred to the genome. Okay, so these things arise by these viruses infecting and integrating into the genome, and then cutting and pasting each other, and then the cells mutating and truncating it to make it inert. If you compare where the inert ERVs are in humans and chimps, and maybe gorillas and monkeys, they too, in the vast majority of cases, are in the same exact places. So what are the possibilities to explain this? One possibility, okay, is that these viral integration events occurred independently in the chimp population and in the human population, okay? And by the way, also in the gorilla population and in the monkey population and all sorts of other animals as well, okay? For that to happen, all right, you have to have independent integration events into a particular human in that population and a particular chimp in the chimp population. And it needs to have been in the germline so that we actually passed that on to progeny. And by genetic drift or natural selection, it propagated in that population such that when you sequence any number of us, you see the same ERV. It's spread throughout the human population. All of that needs to happen for us to be able to see just one ERV. The probability that that happened precisely in the same way was made inert, and then it reinserted itself in the genome, where technically it could be in any one of, let's say, 1,000,000 spots, but it happened to integrate in the same exact location where it did in the human genome, and also spread throughout the chimp population. The probability for that is already exceedingly small. Okay, let's say an ERV can cut and paste itself in 1,000,000 different spots. That's 1 over 1,000,000. Now try to compute that probability for the fact that it's not just one ERV event that we share, but more than 90% of the ERVs we have, their locations are shared with the chimp. That probability is not even, I wouldn't even be able to calculate it for you. Okay, so the likelihood that you have independent integration events of these ERVs, that they independently spread in each of these populations, that they independently became inert in the same exact way and reinserted in the same exact position, it's vanishingly small, that probability. And then when you add that that's for 200,000 ERVs and not just one, it's vanishingly small is an understatement at that point. Okay, so then you have the possibility, a second possibility of, well, I don't know, maybe God just made it that way, and to what? Fool us or trick us or make us think evolution's real, but it's really not, so he's challenging us. I mean, I can't come up with a model there either. And so by far the best explanatory model is that these integration events occurred in a common ancestor, and they have been retained in the human lineage as well as in the chimp lineage. So that the ERVs is just one example of the kinds of molecular genomic evidences that are extremely powerful compared to a lot of the kinds of things that were being done before, like looking at the fossil records and things like that. So that's one example.
Thank you.
Please go ahead.
Hi, my question has something to do with so a big, I guess, foundational pillar for the Christian faith is that God made humans to be different.
Mm-hmm.
So we have the Spirit of Christ, and we're made
Right.
in His image, and all these things. So I also know that when it comes to tracing the evolutionary descent of man, there's a lot of gray areas when it comes to common ancestors, and at what point do you consider the ancient organisms to be primates, or humans versus non-human primates. And so my question is, how do you reconcile that idea of where man came from with the biblical assertion that man is different from other living organisms?
Great question. Let me back up just 1 minute to clarify something, and I'll get to the question that you asked. So I just want to clarify, and we may already share this, but just want to clarify with everybody that believing that God may have used an evolutionary process to bring about the diversity of life we see today is not at all inconsistent with the pillar, as you say, of Christian faith, that humans have been made to be different than other animals. Because I think that the primary difference, being made in the image of God, the language that the Bible uses there, is not physical or material in nature, but spiritual in nature. So we have been given spiritual awareness in a way that I don't think other animals have, and we have been given the ability to ask questions about who God is and seek the answers to those questions, care about the answers to those questions, have a spiritual function in this world. Those are all the ways in which I believe that we've been made in the image of God, and the ways in which to understand that. And that's actually, it's quite common actually, that view that the image of God is ontological and not material. And there are a lot of Christian scholars that have written on that. So that's just a clarification. What I believe the question you're asking ultimately boils down to, and correct me if I'm putting words in your mouth, is at what point is a human a human, right? And at what point did this magical breath of life get placed on these life forms, whatever we want to call them? And how does that affect, I think there's even a follow-up question, I'll make it harder on myself. Follow-up question of, how can we be sure that everybody we're looking at today actually came from whatever God thought was anatomically human, right? Are actually different, so it's sort of, these kinds of questions have been posed. And I'm gonna disappoint you, because the bottom line is I don't know the answer to that. Much in the same way that I don't understand the Trinity. It doesn't make me not believe it, but I have no way, I don't understand how to explain it, right? And so there are gonna be some things like that I think you're absolutely right, they're gray. I don't, as I look back, okay, was that a human? Okay, scientific designation-wise, no, but was it to God? I don't know, So I don't actually know the rules and the prescriptions and the strategies that he used to really ultimately decide, okay, these are the things I'm going to call humans going forward to establish a special relationship with. What I believe is that he did do that at some point in the process of evolution. I believe that our biology is derived in precisely the same way as the biology of animals, but that spiritually we are distinct. And at some point, that distinction comes in. I don't know when that is. And I don't think, this is a clincher here, I don't think Scripture addresses it. And I don't think science has the tools to answer it because it's more of a spiritual question. So I think it's one of those things where it's like, I'm going to trust him that he knew what he was doing. And, you know, but I don't have the answer to that. Thanks for the question, please.
Well, first off, thank you so much for your lecture. Very much enjoyed it, and especially resonated with a lot of your story on faith. Was really looking forward to it, especially with the title, Are We More Than Our Genes? But was shocked to see, when you went to answer that question, you stepped outside of your field, maybe into areas of religious study and history. And I was just curious, is there anything within your field that makes you answer yes?
Anything that I would answer to that, because I think actually the thesis of my talk is that it's a kind of a question that is not classically addressable by science. Mm-hmm. And so what I was trying to set up is to say, let's understand what science is so that we can either be constrained or freed to look elsewhere, right? And so that was sort of the thesis of the talk. But I appreciate your question. Well, if you were constrained to science, right, would there be any clues? Would there be anything within that realm that would help you to answer this question? And, you know, I gotta be honest with you, I don't think so, in the sense that, you know, there are kind of emotional pleas that I could make, or, you know, senses that I could, you know, a sense of humility that I see, or, you know, the beauty that we see, and that, you know, we can point to those kinds of things. But I feel that those are actually quite dangerous because many of those kinds of emotional responses could actually have a very significant naturalistic explanation. And so it falls a little bit into the God of the gaps. And so I'm hesitant to go there because while those are all very real to me, I don't fully understand the sources of those things, or what percentage is this is spiritual and what percentage is, I don't fully grasp that yet. And so I would be a bit hesitant to actually stay within science to answer that question necessarily.
Mm-hmm. Hey, could I?
Please.
And I guess what worries me is a sort of reverse God of the sciences, in which everything's explainable by science. But sticking strictly with science, is there anything within science that it seems if you stick within science, the answer seems to be no, we are not more than our genes.
No, so I would stop you there. I think that what's the most science can say is we don't know. Mm-hmm. And that's the point that I'm trying to make, is science can take you as far as we don't have the tools to answer that question. Mm-hmm. Right? I think it's erroneous when we actually jump a step further and say we think science says no. I don't think it does. Mm-hmm. I think science says, I don't know, I'm agnostic with respect to that. Mm-hmm. I'm not equipped to answer that.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Please.
I have a semi-scientific question. To what extent this question may not even make sense, but to what extent has the human genome explained human consciousness? Because we've been talking a lot about the biology of it, but which is not even, by consciousness I don't necessarily mean awake, and I don't even necessarily mean to implicate reason or awareness, but I sort of mean to talk about humans as subjects of experience. So what does science have to say about that, and is there any kind of genome for humans that's different from animals with that regard?
Yeah, would any differences that we've observed in the genome sequence of humans with respect to other animals be able to explain differences in our state of consciousness or levels of experience? Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think we're in the era where we are actually trying, we're finally able to maybe begin to make connections between the genome and more complicated behavioral phenotypes and things like consciousness, and how do you even encode consciousness, and what are the components of our brain that have to do with when you're feeling something, or when you're more cerebral about something, or when you're those are all things that I think we are actually we have very poor understanding of, and I'm not a neuroscientist per se, although I do have a sister who's a neuroscientist. But those are things that I think we have a very, very poor understanding of. And who knows, maybe the BRAIN initiative from President Obama is going to help us to be able to develop the technologies to better understand things like that. Being a scientist, even though I'm not a neuroscientist, my sentiment is that we are actually going to be able to make at least some primitive connections between, if not our genome, at the anatomical level, okay? What separates us from maybe other animals in terms of things like consciousness? What makes it so challenging is that those terms are so hard to define. You know, in science, we're used to measuring things that are very clearly definable, right? So if we say, you know, do you have diabetes or not, right? We set a threshold on your blood glucose levels at fasting and say, you've got it or you don't, right? Or we can measure quantitative traits like your BMI or, you know, things like that. When it comes to behavioral phenotypes, while I think we have a lot of growth in that area, I still think we're going to be stymied by the, you know, lack in the heterogeneity in the way that we define some of these parameters. And so I think that might affect the ability of science to answer some of the questions or to be able to map and identify molecular correlates of consciousness, right, and things like that. But I think we'll actually get a lot closer than we are today. And that's yet another reason why I don't like to make an appeal to sort of emotional sentiments within my experience in science as a way of addressing the question, are we more than our genes? Because it may be recursive. Those emotional sentiments may very well be explained in large part by the material substance of my body. But we don't have the answers to that yet.
Hey, oh my goodness, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I was instructed,
loud and clear.
I was instructed to talk loud before I came up here, so I want to make sure that I'm talking loud. I have two questions that are somewhat related, I think. The first one is, I think I understand you to be saying that there's no discovery that can be made in biology that would challenge your faith. So I wanted, and that's true. So I was going to ask if there's any material observation that could be made about the world that would make you question your faith, in the sense maybe, I don't know if you consider archaeology to be a science on the same level as biology, but let's say it was proven beyond a shadow of reasonable doubt that Jesus' body was found. Something like that, some sort of something material that we could know about the world.
Yep.
That would cause you to question your faith. And the second, I think, sort of related thing is this is ostensibly supposed to be sort of promotion of dialogue between faith and reason, or something along those lines. How much does it matter to you if faith is reasonable?
If faith is reasonable?
That your personal faith is reasonable.
Okay. So let me address the first question. So you're asking. I'm sorry. Can you say the first question again? I'm stuck on faith reasonable. And now I'm thinking about what I'm going to say about that. Yeah. So what was your first question?
Is there any material
discovery
that can be
that's an odd question for me to be able to answer. It's a perfectly fair one, but it's an odd question because I live in a state of confidence. It's again, I'll go to the example of my love for my wife. If you got up and said, if I could prove to you that your wife didn't love you, would you still believe that she loved you? Like, that's how it feels to me. Like, I just want to give you a sense of how I respond to that question. And I'm sort of like, but she loves me, right? So it's something that it's so deeply ingrained in me because, in part, of the work that I've done, but also because of the depth of the relationship. Right? That's very critical, right? And so that it is a bit of a sort of cognitive dissonance for me to ask that question, for me to answer that question. What I will say, however, is just sort of reiterate that there are very specific historical, archaeological things that have to be true, right? And so I was saying earlier that everything rests on the empty tomb or the validity of the resurrection, right? And so, yes, in fact, this is not me saying it, it's St. Paul in the scriptures saying, if it were to be shown that the resurrection didn't happen, then Christians are to be pitied among all men, because it's all a waste of time, right? And so in a way, that answers your question, despite the fact that it is a bit of a dissonance for me. Okay, is your faith reasonable? I think that it matters to me that the short pithy answer is in part, okay? In part, it matters to me that it's reasonable. And that's sort of what I was trying to take you through in my experience. It was very critical to me to examine, for example, as I shared with you, the historicity, but there are so many other things that I spent time examining, and people talk about contradictions in the Gospels. I pored over those kinds of things. It was very important to me that I was reflective, that I was thoughtful, that I entertained challenges, that I challenged myself. The process had to be reasonable and logical, and I defined that by, I have to take every mental faculty available to me to address the plausibility of this, right? But also, like the point I made, that's not sufficient. There is a leap of faith that you take, right? I mean, none of what I said today is proof, right? If it was, right, like we wouldn't be having this conversation. Everybody would have already looked through it all and would have just proven everything to everybody, right? It's my experience with, a set of observations that to me seemed highly plausible and highly reasonable. That didn't, again, like I said, bring me to full faith. It brought me to a place where I was maybe willing to be vulnerable to accept the possibility, right? And so there, something else does take over. Right? So that there is a logic and a well thought out and reasoned process, but it is not completely sufficient to bring you to faith, I believe.
Thank you for your talk. I was just wondering, how would you say the Genesis model fits? Genesis account fits into the evolutionary model of creation, and were Adam and Eve the first spiritual humans, or what was their role in that?
Yeah. So the latter way that you described it is very much actually a dominant model. And I want to stress, it's not a new model. It's not something we've come up with to try to conform with new scientific evidence. Their early church fathers were, having nuanced positions with regard to Genesis. Augustine is one example. So I'll recommend a book to you all. It's called Creation or Evolution, Do We Have to Choose? And it's written by Dennis Alexander, who's the director of the Faraday Institute in England. And he's written really, really well and cogently on how various Christian scholars and theologians have actually interpreted Genesis in the past, and what kinds of models may be perfectly scriptural and still be consistent with the evolutionary model. Okay, I think the question of how you read Genesis kind of comes back to this notion of, are you literal or are you not? Right? And if you're not literal about Genesis, then are you not literal about Exodus, and then maybe not literal about Matthew, and then maybe you're not literal about Jesus at all, right? And so in one fell swoop, by saying that maybe Genesis isn't literal, you're really threatening the core of the faith, right? And so I understand that fundamental concern. But as came up during the coffee hour, I think the best way to define and apply literality is to think about what was intended. As a believer, you would say what was intended by God, but I think you could even just say what was intended by the authors of the text. What are we supposed to be learning when we read Genesis? What are we supposed to be understanding and learning when we read, Song of Songs? I mean, for every book, we should apply that kind of mentality. And so, it's many people have actually read Genesis in completely different ways. Right? We referenced at the coffee hour that there are other segments of Scripture that, if taken quote unquote literally, where we say we are going to take the exact words here and not apply any kind of poeticism to it or anything else, right? Then the example that I gave was the sun set, right? Or other examples from Scripture that seem to suggest that it's the sun that actually moves and the earth doesn't, right? Today we kind of laugh at the notion of taking that kind of thing, quote unquote, literally. But that's exactly what happened between the church and Galileo, right? So I think what we need to do the hard work as a Christian community to say, where may we be making similar mistakes? And is Genesis one of those places where we're not wrestling enough about what it is that God intends to say? I'm not asking anybody in this room who's a Christian to dilute their faith and dilute what they think Scripture says to accept some new scientific fad. But I am saying that we need to do the reflective work to think about exactly what it is that God and the authors intend in that text.
Sorry. I was most curious curious about Adam and Eve and what you think like their role was. Like, do they were the first spiritual humans, or
Yeah, I mean, I can give you my personal view on this, and just yeah, I don't know where Veritas stands on all of this, so don't, it's not representative of any other organization except for myself. But, I do believe in the historicity of Adam and Eve, okay? But I do not believe that they were the only humans that were around, and I think that there are scriptural bases to potentially support that. Certainly not, I think, enough to refute that possibility. That's my reading and my understanding, and there are a number of people that share that position. I very much like the way that you characterize them being as spiritual heads. There is a kind of, when as Christians, what we think is that, Jesus was the propitiation for our sins, right? And so the righteousness is imputed unto all of us. How? I don't know exactly what the mechanism is there, right? But I think in the same way, as Adam and Eve are selected as historical figures, in the presence of presumably lots of other humans, okay, as spiritual representatives of humanity, right? And that their rebellion, right, is, again, kind of imputed to all of the rest of humanity, right? And so this kind of strange tie between, sin having to be inherited biologically from one generation to the next, I don't think that's necessarily the case scripturally, at least with my reading. And so that's my nuanced position on it. But the reason why I recommend Dennis Alexander is because he presents actually a number of other ways in which one might think about this. And I just want to say, I really appreciate that question for another reason as well, and that is to say that, when you think of camps like theistic evolution or evolutionary creationism, it's not as monolithic as you might imagine. I mean, some people differ, for example, on this question of Adam and Eve, and so they are good questions to ask, and people may have more nuanced positions. Please go ahead.
If you may, I was wondering if you could at least briefly continue talking about why you specifically believe that Jesus is God.
Yeah, well, I tried to give you a little bit of a flavor of two things. One, what made me more open than I had ever been before. That part was more my, study and examination and trying to read up on texts and doing the best that I could to understand what information and data was out there. All of that, though, led me to a certain kind of openness to the possibility that I didn't have prior to that, but it certainly didn't prove anything to me. And I hope I won't disappoint, but I certainly, any of the rest of what I did won't prove anything to you or anybody else either. And I have no interest in doing that because I think that just can't be done. It's because I'm moving away from a scientific approach to, what I would characterize as a more emotional or spiritual, enterprise. I mean, that's what I mean by developing this in my life as part of a relationship, right? And so, there, I think it's got to be me and you having coffee, and me just you trusting me and me sharing my life about why this started to make sense for me, how a lot of things started to come together. So it's a really loaded question. And I'm not afraid to answer it, it's just that it's very complicated because it has to do with things that are not actually that definable. And I understand that can feel a little bit like a cop-out from a certain vantage point, but I think it's a lot of the way that we experience life in other areas of life, right? Again, love is another example that's like that. It's like, there are a number of sort of scientific things that you can do, but at some point, it's like you jump into this because it makes sense. And it seems to fit in a way that is tough to kind of just logically lay out and prove to someone. Yeah. Go ahead, please.
Hey, Doc, thanks for sharing with us. My question is more personal in nature, but how do your sort of interactions with your colleagues and sort of like your professional working environment, how is that shaped by your faith? Whether you receive more respect or less in the scientific community because of your faith, and how has your faith sort of shaped your interactions with others?
Those are great questions, and I mean this. I'd be more than happy to talk with you in person as well, because those are things I do think about a lot, and I think a lot of Christians, particularly in academia, think about that. I've chosen a track. Clearly, I'm up here talking to everybody, being videotaped. That I'm not a closet Christian in my academic setting. I know a lot of colleagues who are, because they will be ridiculed, pitied at best, right, and ridiculed at worst, and it may have an impact on them professionally, and I understand that, and I respect the decision that they make on that. So it is a very difficult choice. But I personally believe that the strength of my scientific work will and should speak for itself, right? I am there to do science, and they've given me a responsibility to lead and direct a research lab. And I would want to be assessed on the basis of the strength and the quality and of my scientific work and the contributions that I make. And I trust the people that I work with, whether they, vast majority will disagree with me on my theological views. But I trust them professionally to judge me on that basis. Now, if I'm wrong, I'll have to face the consequences of that. But that's the step that I've taken. Does that help answer at least one of your questions?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Was there another one in there that I'm missing?
I don't think so. I guess I was more curious personally about whether or not you built sort of deeper relationships with people in your field.
Right, okay, so there was, I wanted to address that. So, because you started by asking, how has your faith shaped the way that you interact with people in your workplace? Was that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I told you the story about how I was first so taken aback by how Jesus' actions were so completely for others and not for himself in that moment on the cross. And I think that should typify the life of every Christian. And so in my workplace, the answer should be, and I hope that it is, that people matter more than things, right? So I operate in a dog-eat-dog world where you got to publish or perish, right? You've got to, you're not going to get tenure if you don't get X amount of publications, you don't bring in the grant money, and there's a lot of pressure, and I won't deny that, right? But if I give in to that pressure, I got to do my job, but if I give into that pressure to the point where, I am starting to prioritize my success and the things that I'm doing in the lab over the people that I'm interacting with in my lab or otherwise, I'm starting to fail, in my view, and that I'm not fulfilling the calling for why I'm there. I must be and should be prioritizing the people that are around me, and that's going to be a delicate balance, but there are all sorts of little things, lifestyle choices at work, right? The kinds of culture that you set in your lab, little things that you can do to, that can go a long way, I think, in establishing that culture of people over things.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so if we're restricting the definition of evolution to changes in allele frequencies, is the human population under any significant selective pressures as far as we know as scientists? So is the human population evolving currently or in recent human history, and if so, how do you reconcile that evolution with us being made in the image of an everlasting God?
Yeah. So again, I don't think there's any problem at all, because I think I don't think it's that I have 5 fingers that makes me made in the image of God, or that I have this kind of body type, right? Or that I have a certain kind of, nasal arrangement. Like, I don't think it's those things that, God really harps on as to whether or not we're in his image or not. I think it's more spiritual and functional and purpose in nature. So I think the question still applies that if we're evolving, could some of our functions and purposes change, or could we change enough bodily that some of those things could be altered? How do we think about that, right? To answer your first question, there is evidence that we're evolving. And to some extent, the strength of the evidence depends on how recent you want to be. Evolution operates on scales that are just really, really long. And so, we can't really be asking questions like, did we evolve last year, right? That's, right, it's not, if it's just, have allele frequencies changed in the population? Yeah, for that, we can say we evolved last year. There was a new gene pool, new babies were born, right? So alleles at certain loci are slightly different. So if you're just going to define it as allele frequencies changing, yeah, we're evolving all the time. Every second, baby's born and alters the gene pool, right? So yes, but I think what you're driving at is, are we changing enough that it begins to affect, right, the really significant things that then make us question how this connects with us being made in the image of God, right? And examples of recent evolution are things like the lactase. I don't know if you're familiar with that example. And I won't go into it now in the interest of time, but you can look it up. It's actually a very, very interesting story for which there's now very compelling evidence about how specific genes that allow you to process enzymes, proteins in milk have evolved in certain human populations. But it's a very interesting question right now in terms of whether we have actually slowed the rate of evolution, because we have now medical intervention, right, that counteracts natural selection, in ways that I think are really difficult to quantify. So how have we actually maybe slowed or altered or changed, the way natural selection might be operating otherwise without so much darn human intervention, right? So I think that's a good question, but I don't know. I mean, I don't know, how much we are really affecting the pace of some of these evolutionary processes by the intervention, the kinds of external pressures that we're imposing on the system. And so the reason why I'm harping on that is it enough that it really just severely slows it, that we don't have to worry about it, before Jesus comes back, right? As from a believer's standpoint, right? So, I mean, I'm not sure. Yeah.
Okay. So, we're going to close this door first, so I'll listen back. We're going to close with one more question, and then, I'm sorry, but they can have first go at you at the reception. So I want to say, first of all, we're going to have, if you have the time, we're going to have a little reception with coffee and lemonade and water and snacks right down at the end of this hall, basically. So as soon as we're done here after this last question, Praveen will be down there, and you can engage with him a little bit more and with each other. I want to thank you very much for taking the time and the energy to come down here and spend time with us. Really appreciate that. Thank you all also for giving up your night. So on behalf of InterVarsity and RUF and the Religious Life community here at Emory, thank you as well. So without further ado, we're going to take Peter's last question here, and then immediately following, please come join us for a light reception right after this is over. And you can hound him more.
Yeah, so thank you again for coming. Really means a lot for you taking your time. So one question I have is, has your research, or even I guess your personal, has your research affected your choice in a specific denomination in your faith growth, or even maybe restricted you, I guess, to some extent? And also you mentioned, I guess, both in your kind of introduction, your work with Francis Collins, and if you maybe want to share a little bit about how maybe working with Francis Collins has affected your faith and what that has looked like.
Yeah. Francis is, of course I'm biased, but I think he's the world's greatest mentor. He's not only a scientist of scientists. That I don't need to say a lot about because it's well documented. But as a person, he's just really one of the greatest people I've had the privilege and the blessing to know, to be trained by. He has really imbued in me a strong sense of and importance of scientific rigor in the approaches that I take in the lab, and at the same time has shown me an example of how you live out Christian love in an environment that can be so often filled with vitriol, with just very acrimonious environment. He's the kind of person that I would have meetings with him about the progress in my scientific work when I was training with him, and he would have just come back from being on the Hill and having met with, I don't know, Kathleen Sebelius or Rahm Emanuel or someone, and someone more important than me, I can tell you that. And he would come and meet with me, and there would be no distinction in the manner in which he approached the significance of the conversation up on Capitol Hill than with me. And then in the next breath and in the next minute would be off to the clinic to meet a child with some rare disease. And again, you would not see any distinction. It wasn't an asterisk in his day. Each of these things were equally important to him. You know, they were different and maybe treated them slightly differently, but genuinely equally important. He would say that, and he lived it out. And I think that that's remarkable. And whether people have spewed all sorts of, antagonistic thoughts toward Francis, and people have raised him up on a pedestal as well, right? And everything in between, right? His ability to kind of stay on the straight and narrow, be balanced, show love and grace toward the people that oppose him, and be humble in the face of adoration and praise, right, is a remarkable example to me. And if I'm even a fraction a fraction of the success that he's had in science, I will hope to emulate the way in which he's kind of lived out his Christian faith in science. So there's a first question there that.
About the nomination.
Yeah, that might be one to talk about at with some lemonade in hand. So yeah, because and I'm not sure whether the answer that I would give to that is necessarily what you're looking for, but it's so interesting that you asked that because I've never really processed it and thought about it in that way. But what I'll say now is that generically, being a part of this faith and science debate that's happening nationally now, and I think I'm being kind when I call it a debate. More often, it's filled with a lot of nasty vitriol, right? And even within the Christian community, we're not setting a good example whatsoever in a lot of different places. And so engaging that very closely, as I have been doing, has really in some ways impacted maybe the way that I want to, the kind of environment that I feel most at home in terms of worship. And I think maybe one way to characterize that would be, unity in essentials and liberty in non-essentials. I mean, there are things that don't affect, from a biblical or Christian point of view, our salvation or whatever else that we might be interested in thinking about, in spiritual life. But yet we have elevated, right, in the national discussion to a place where it doesn't belong, right, as Christians. And again, that comes back to not setting a good example of who we are and what we really believe. And I think we have to bear some of the responsibility of that and to go out into the communities and engage people and be clear about the fact that you don't have to check your brain at the door despite what they hear and see. And I think we have more work to do in that damage control. But I think that's maybe the way that it's shaped me a little bit in terms of thinking about where I worship and how I worship.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.